Thank you. Judy forgot to tell you how much I've learned from her. That's the other thing. Judy, as you know, her new book is one where you can really read in the bone what the whole history of picturing Canada is about. And so thank you. That was very kind. And I did want to say thank you to the other Judy, for this invitation to do a pre-publication talk to Keywords for Children's Literature. And really, thank you, Judy. I really have learned a lot, and it's a huge pleasure to be here today. Now, the problem with Keywords is there's actually no book yet. As Judy said, we are in the copy edit stage, actually. So, and we have sent the copy edit. So it's going to be a very big book. And I could pass this around, too. So it just seems to be, maybe I will do that. Here you go. So this is a copy, but I may need it back if I have to refer to it later. But there's the copy edit of the book. So, but in any case, it's a little bit tricky to do a talk when no one knows what it is you're talking about. So I've got a system where I'm going to do this. So bear with me, and if I get boring, you can stop me. In any case, I thought what I would do is start by bringing you greetings from Phil Nell, whom you met last year. And we both recognize that you are probably the perfect audience for Keywords, as you define yourselves as exactly the kinds of multidisciplinary children's literature scholars that we sought to address. Now, we know that you understand exactly the kinds of problems routinely encountered when people from different disciplines get together to talk about what they think is the same subject, only to find out they've got completely different assumptions about what's on the agenda. Now, with that context in mind, same subject, different agenda, I decided to begin with an uncomfortable story about one such occasion. It actually occurred to me subsequently that yesterday I began with an embarrassing story. I don't actually make a habit of telling embarrassing stories, but it looks like this just turned out this way. And it was a panel discussion on poetry at a conference, and the conference shall remain nameless. The idea, which seemed like a good idea when we proposed it, was to bring to the table poets, teachers, academics, some in education, some in literature, let them have about 6 minutes each to have a say as quickly and simply as possible of what they thought they were doing when they were engaging children with poetry. And you should know it was pretty much a disaster from the beginning, although I'm going to let Richard Flynn, who wrote about the occasion, you can see it really had a very strong impact on all of us, in his Sphere of Poetry essay, which is in the Cambridge Companion to Children's Literature, which is new. And here's his account from his perspective of what happened. So here's Richard. Oh, and actually, here's Richard. I advocated musicality as the salient quality of the best contemporary children's verse, he says. But an audience member seemed almost offended by the notion and insisted that she did not permit her elementary students to use rhyme in the poetry she asked them to write. Okay, Richard then continues. It became clear from several responses that poetry pedagogy in schools almost always involves creative writing instruction and very seldom advocates reading or performing poetry for pleasure. The aforementioned teacher forbade her students to use rhyme, she said, and this is a quotation, because it gets in the way of self-expression. After the session, everyone felt really bad. Okay, what became very clear on that unfortunate day was that poets and literary scholars focused on poetry as art, discipline, something that required study, attention to the tune of the verse, and is something that connected children, people, to literary tradition, as well as to emotional and lived experience. The teachers, on the other hand, primarily saw poetry as part of a literacy curriculum and as self-expression, as the teacher Richard Quote says, and we're not interested in communicating techniques, particularly, or discussions on critical value judgments. You'll be very pleased to know that poetry is not a keyword, for reasons I'll explain in a moment when I address the scope of keywords. But I wanted to tell the story because it offers clues on our reasons for constructing our keywords volumes and our sense of a potential audience. I also wanted to begin the story as it gives me a point of departure, and it's actually a rhetorical strategy. You can think about it and use it in future. I picked up from Ted Hughes. Make the difficult point first and move on. One of the reasons I thought I could risk confessing my embarrassing story at the beginning is that I knew I could trust that you would trust that I knew you'd already been addressing contentious issues in your regular colloquia and in your regular interactions with each other. So I appreciated Phil's sense of a need for a volume to address the evolutionary lines of words that tend to turn up in scholarly work on children's literature in various disciplines, but often with wildly and different interpretations. Now, the word keyword is a case in point. You can play this game too. Okay. Though you should feel free to stop me if you think my terms are problematic. For people who work in library science, say the word keyword, and what comes to mind? Okay. It's something that goes in the library. It's a search term, something that identifies the main content of the document. Did I get that right? Oh, good. All right. If, on the other hand, you happen to have been a teacher who used Ladybird readers as a form of reading instruction, and you should know that my own child grade 1 teacher was one, and it was a little difficult for me, as you can imagine, then the word keyword might put you in mind of what was called the Keywords Reading Scheme, published by Ladybird, who claimed to introduce children, and this is a quotation, to the most commonly used words in English language. Now, that is in the frame of reference used by the Ladybird book editors. Keywords defines commonly used words in English. So it's also what you might know as a controlled vocabulary system or a limited vocabulary. Now, if you happen to be talking to someone from cultural studies or literature, keywords has a different meaning. Any guesses? You've got this. It's Raymond Williams. And that's what will come to mind. And it's his famous 1976 book, Keywords, which Williams describes as an exploration of the vocabulary of a crucial area of social and cultural discussion. I'll read that again. An exploration of the vocabulary of a crucial area of social and cultural discussion. Now, as Williams explained of his project, and Phil and I say of ours, what we've done is it's not a dictionary, nor is it a series of footnotes to dictionary history. Instead, we call it a record of an inquiry into a vocabulary. Like Williams, we're interested in what we describe, and we kept telling our authors, conflicted or contested words. And we're interested in mapping the meanings of those words. Unlike Williams, who wrote all his own keywords entries, and though I have to confess, I'm not sure if you've been reading keywords lately, but he wasn't that good a writer, actually. His prose was often a little teeny bit awkward. We decided to follow the format used by a couple of our recent keywords updates and invite specialist contributors to write with us. Our models, just so you know, I'm not sure if anybody's seen these. New Keywords, a revised vocabulary of culture and society. Anybody seen that? By Tony Bennett, Lawrence Grossberg, and Megan Morris, and Keywords for American Cultural Studies by Bruce Burgett and Glenn Handler. No, so what Phil and I then did is we invited 47 people. We were planning on 50, but it didn't quite work out. And Phil and I each wrote an essay, Phil on postmodernism and mine on literacy, to the volume, which in the end does contain 49 essays. Now, because at this point I realized that no book is available, I recognized I was going to have a problem talking about a book that does not exist. So I thought that one way to do that might be via some of our rejected cover designs. Okay, so we're doing rejections today in a large way. And because we spend a lot of time talking about what didn't work, because we wanted the cover to say something about our content. Now, books, as you know, are judged by their covers, despite advice to the contrary. So we've been at pains to find a cover that conveys something of the historical trace of the words defined in our volume and something of the multidisciplinary, historical, critical nature of the task. It's you've had people talking about literature and stories and art. Talking about criticism and critical vocabularies is a much tougher sell. So here's our first attempt. This is Phil's. Can you see this okay? Now, Phil liked you know what this one has? It has a little pointer. Isn't that good? Phil liked these blocks. It had something of the three-dimensionality, and he liked the idea of building blocks towards a scholarly vocabulary. I was concerned that the blocks were a little too cute. You too. Oh, good. Thank you. You should know that we haven't decided on a cover, so I'm taking any feedback. And mass-produced, and they didn't convey either the theoretical or historical trace that we were trying to communicate. I liked the graphic idea of the three-dimensionality, so I did try some Osborne early children's books versions of alphabet games, and I don't have a copy of the image, but the results really looked too much like something to do with children's book history, so it was scrapped. I was also concerned that the historical blocks failed to communicate a sense of the contemporary critical complexity. So we thought we'd try some, okay, you reckon Anno's, okay, I like this. This was my idea, Anno's letters, and I like the three-dimensionality of them. I like the fact that they're impossible, like Escher drawings, and that's what happens when you're trying to do the words too. They invite the same kind of trace that we'd asked of our authors. The letters convey a physical desire to put your finger on it, and trace it round, and then you find out it doesn't work. We've not approached Anno, but it's because Phil and I have both paid permissions bills, and we were afraid we were going to be charged per letter. So we thought we'd try other options first. And we were beginning to worry that the letters alone weren't enough to convey the sense of mapping the history of key terms and explaining how they came to be used in conflicted ways. At this point, so we're open to suggestions. At this point, we gave this to our publishers in the New York University Press and said their book designers would have a go. Now, they did offer some interesting takes on our verbal ideas, but these are also rejects. So here we go. All right. Now, we like this version, and you can't tell, but it is a very muddy shade of green, and we weren't crazy about the green. Old blocks, modern print, and our names, but the letters are not clear enough. And there's also, there's no apostrophe in children's, and Wren's on its own looks particularly stupid. So we were grumpy about that one. And we also didn't like the generic image of children. I'm not sure you can actually, there's an image on the bottom, and you can see that there's a big problem with this. It's completely invisible, right? But there is a kind of antique vision of children winding yarn, like it's a pun, I guess, with books in the background, and it's supposed to be a kind of stock image. Now, both Phil and I have a really much better sense of what's available in the historical images. And we also sent some of these cover designs to some of our friends who were very good graphic artists. And they wrote very excellent critiques on these. And here, as you know, I did want to say, Judy, the cover of your book is perfect. And actually, I just gave Judy the cards from the Osborne. The moose is completely perfect. Iconic, funny, too, does the historical trace. Perfect for your book. So you might want to, at some point, talk about choosing the cover for Picturing Canada. So we're not there yet. Anyway, so here's another one we also rejected. Okay, now this one is also, and as you can see, they got the title wrong. They called it Keywords of Children's Literature instead of Keywords for Children's Literature. They did notice this at some point. But at first glance, when I looked at it through the miracle of Photoshop, I thought it was supposed to be a book that was face down, which seemed to me like a pretty good idea. Because it would be, however, it's backwards, and as Phil pointed out, it's not face down anyway. It's a title page, but it's still backwards, and it still doesn't work, and it's the wrong way around. Okay, so I did this tour on rejected covers because I wanted to give you a sense that what we are trying to do in Keywords for Children's Literature is something that does give you access to the historical trace and critical insights, something that suggests a multiple address to teachers, academics, authors, people in literature, education and library information science, publishers, but it couldn't be too cute or too instructive. In the end, our cover's concerns raised an issue which is about the conflicted and contested ideas in children's literature studies. And then the term that I'm going to start with, I'm going to take you on a kind of partial tour. It's not a term, the first term I'm going to talk about is not one we actually put into our proposal. And it was suggested to us by one of the people we approached to write the entry. Now, this is a guessing game, and so you do have to guess this person. Who's that? Thank you. We knew that. Now, Philip Pullman it's a little bit, just to get you in the mood, he's obviously the most easily recognizable contributor, and he did ask me to credit this photograph to a guy named T.K. Bruce. And although some of our authors do publish fiction and poetry, Philip is probably the one who identifies himself primarily as an author, although, as you know, he's a very good scholar and critic as well. Now, it was Philip who posed his word to us. He said, could he write about intention? All right? And we knew that it was not a conventionally contested word in keywords, but once Philip suggested it, we knew that his words would offer the possibility of hypertextual links we'd imagined for keywords that we'd already included in our example. So we knew that Philip's essay on intention might lead readers to want to read essays on children's literature as a term, or innocence, or liminality, or cross-writing, or censorship. Now, Philip's interest in writing about intention came out of his contact, regular. He does book tours, especially when people kept asking, especially children, kept asking him questions. And it does strike at the very heart of children's literature studies. And it's a question about whether a text is marked or unmarked for children. Philip begins his essay with a series of questions of the kind frequently posed to him. You will recognize these questions. What was your intention in writing this book? What did you mean by the passage on page 108? What do you want the reader to feel at the end? What message did you intend the book to deliver? Now, in fact, it is the kind of question that publishers ask, that authors ask. Now, and yet, you know, it's exactly the sort of questions that literary critics are just kind of put their eyes, their hands over their eyes and say, oh no, don't they know about Wimsatt and Beardsley's 1946 essay on the intentional fallacy? Don't they know? You can't ask that question, that it's naive, stupid, and impossible. But Philip knows that the literary critic's dismissal is too simplistic a way of doing it. And he knows that it's not a naive or impossible question. And he says, and he recognizes as well that it's completely churlish to deny that people who actually read novels and like reading novels, that they might want to get the reading right, and their concern comes from that kind of desire. Philip then goes on to play through a terrific series of examples of his own complicated relationship with intention in the composition of one of his books, The Scarecrow and His Servant, which was published in 2004. You should know that I think that what I'm doing today is a kind of trailer, like a movie trailer for the book. Okay. Within the discussion, you're just getting, the high bits that you see in the trailer. Within this discussion, Philip recognizes that authors have one kind of relationship with intention, and it's not the same relationship that critics and scholars have. And then Philip very cleverly positions various stakeholders in his intention debate, including publishers, who he says, in an attempt to increase sales, this is a quotation, no offense taken, to put an age figure on the cover of every book. And in Britain, there was a very strong move for this to happen, like every book had to have an age. Philip and several other authors resisted the idea. Now, if, when the book is published, you happen to begin reading keywords for children's literature with Philip's essay, which is something you might well do, since he's the most famous person, taking into account some of the issues he raises, you might consider where to go next. You might go to take a look at the childhood essay by Karen Sanchez-Epler in order to get a better sense of the relationship between intention and audience. Or maybe you could move directly to Beverly Lyon Clark's essay on audience, or Charles Hatfield on the graphic novel, so you could focus on Philip's discussion. He's very good on the graphic elements of The Scarecrow with His Servants. Or June Cummins on marketing. And keywords is like that. That's the way we intended. Each essay is intended to suggest possible hypertextual moves to another essay, which is exactly what we'd intended, pun intended, when we designed the volume. Now, because Philip's essay centers his essay on the discussion on intention of a single book intended for children, I decided that my next move in this preview should go from the particular to the general. And so I decided to go with children's literature as a hotly contested term in the field. Which part of the phrase dominates? Children's, with the attention to the audience, or literature, attention to the text? And that, of course, is a debate for children's literature critics. Now, since I'm playing identification games, I'm going to show you the author of the children's literature. Do you know who that is? Anybody know who that is? No, not a filmmaker. Anybody recognize that person? This is partly a game of one person's famous name is another person's no name, you know. It's Peter Hunt. Okay. He's looking very relaxed, is Peter. This was his choice of photograph. And he's, so Peter, as you'll know, he's either in France or Belgium where he's been hanging out, but he actually lives in the UK and was Professor Emeritus in Children's Literature at Cardiff. Now, Peter was important because he was really one of the first scholars to start to assemble some of the major scholarly apparatus for children's literature studies. And developing the scholarly apparatus for a discipline is one of the things that's tricky to do. And it's how you can then begin to run the kinds of programs, master's degree programs, PhD programs. You need the stuff to talk about it. You need a critical language. And Peter was the one who was doing it. Now, Peter turned out, he did the Routledge Encyclopedia of Children's Literature, which was one of the first pieces. Now, Peter was perfect for the essay, and he had some helpful insights on understanding both the children and the literature components of children's literature. So here's Peter. The body of the text, however constituted, can be seen as a symbiotic, movable feast. The book defines its audience, children, and that in turn affects how children are generally defined, as well as how they actually are in the future. In this context, the term children is increasingly being interpreted as comparatively inexperienced or unskilled readers. So in children's literature, he worries that what we're doing when we talk about children is what we mean is an unskilled reader, and that's pretty worrying. Because of the possessive, the element children in children's literature does not have the same same standing as the adjective Canadian in Canadian literature. Children's literature is one of the relatively few categories of text defined by its audience. Peter then does a really beautiful essay on the historical trace of children's literature and does attend to the general brief that we had that we given to our authors, which was to cite Raymond Williams, if possible, and to cite the Oxford English Dictionary, because we wanted both the etymological trace and the cultural trace. Now, children isn't a term that Williams defines in keywords, so Peter's gone straight to the OED, where he finds that children are unhelpfully defined as boys or girls. You'll be pleased to know. Like, who knew? Peter then goes on to turn to Williams, and he addresses the idea of popular literature. With issues about children, literature, audience, and intention, raised by Peter and Philip, I thought I'd move next to the idea of innocence. You should know that it was Margaret Meek in England who did the essay on reading, so that's another kind of way where she addresses that idea. Now, you ready for the next one? Now, who knows who this is? Anybody? Nope. No? Okay. Actually, it's not a problem for this. This is why this game is like this. It's Maura Gubar, who's the Associate Professor of English and Director of the Children's Literature Program at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's the author of Artful Dodgers, Reconceiving the Golden Age of Children's Literature, which just won the Children's Literature Association Award. So while Philip's essay on intention comes out of his long work as a practicing novelist, Maura's essay comes out of very intense scholarship. She also writes really exquisitely, beautifully, focusing on exactly the detail. And this is what we wanted in our authors to do in these smallish essays. They run about 4,000 words each, 3,000, it depends. And so she focuses on exactly the detail that becomes the touchstone of the discussion. Here's Maura on innocence, and it's really lovely to start. Pondering the immense popularity of young starlets, such as Deanna Durbin, Shirley Temple, Graham Greene declared in 1939, innocence, and this is a quotation, innocence is a tricky subject. Its appeal is not always so clean as a whistle. While Temple's charms ostensibly lay in her perfect purity, he argued, in fact, she functioned as a highly eroticized figure. Indeed, Temple's first films were a series of shorts known as baby burlesques that placed tiny children in compromising positions. Boy, she's hot stuff, remarks one of Temple's male admirers in one of these shorts. And her later films likewise situate her as an object of intense desire. Building on and extending Green's argument, James Kincaid contends in Erotic Innocence that our culture has enthusiastically sexualized the child while denying just as enthusiastically that it isn't doing any such thing. He piles up compelling proof that the physical makeup of the child, big eyes, narrow chin, waif-like slightness, now coincides with what our vision is of sexually alluring. Providing further support of this claim, Hugh Hefner has noted in the Playboy Playmate of the Month, which is a distinctly juvenile appellation, was inspired by good girl art of George Petty, whose pin-ups in Esquire had the wholesomeness of the girl next door, but acknowledged her sexuality as well. Petty's image of a voluptuous girl swathed in pink rabbit outfit may well have inspired the creation of the Playboy Bunny, that iconic marriage of cute and sexy, innocent and erotic. Now, it's a perfect beginning to an essay. And she goes on to develop very exquisitely the construction of innocence through the romantics in and out of popular culture, contrasting the conflicted positions of sex and death in the context of innocence. And she has a really good section on the Twilight series by Stephanie Myers. Now, Mara's Innocence essay does exactly what we asked all our authors to do, which was find the historical trace, address its conflicted position, and refer to the examples, historical and contemporary, drawn from children's literature and culture. Now, but Maura ends her essay by sniffing out a change in cultural constructions of innocent children. She concludes by hinting that the possibility that there might well be a different story to be told about different children, though she admits she's not quite sure what that story might be, yet suggests that it will involve a move away from binary thinking, innocence and experience, that sets children up as blank, alien others, and she thinks it's going to move towards a more flexible paradigm, which acknowledges that they are akin to adults. Children are akin to adults in diversity, complexity, embeddedness, in particular sociocultural milieu. Now, it seemed to me that where Maura ends up is an idea in betweenness. I don't know if you can know where I'm going from here, but something between the binary oppositions of ignorance and innocence, between presence and absence of knowledge about sex or death. So, where would my keywords hypertextual trace move to now? It takes me to liminality, which is about betweenness. Anybody know who this is? Do you know this person? No, it's actually not a problem, any of these. It's Michael Joseph, who's a rare books librarian at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and the owner. Does anybody own the Childlit listserv? Okay, it's Michael who owns the Childlit listserv and keeps us all connected. And Michael wrote about liminality. Now, liminality is a pretty interesting word. It's a newish word. Does anybody know it? Anybody been using it? Anybody? You've been using liminality sometimes? And it's not a word that's in Williams. Liminality is what we think about as an up-and-coming keyword. And you should know that just the other day, as I was walking by Robarts Library, which is the main University of Toronto library, and I live in Toronto, it's close to where I live, I saw a man wearing a T-shirt, and the T-shirt said, "Liminal State." Okay. Isn't that good? And I have to get Michael a T-shirt. And so Michael traces the term through Victor Turner, who coined it in 1969. The interesting thing about liminality is that it describes exactly a quality of indeterminacy, ambiguity, selflessness, becomingness. And so it's a term actually that's often used in context of adolescence. But in children's literature, it's a term that's often veers into something monstrous and gothic. It's a term of the space between. So it's like Wonderland or Oz. And so it's a lovely, lovely essay on these idea of liminal spaces, of between spaces, as well as of what is the relationship between innocence and experience. Okay, knowledge and not, sexual and eroticized, and innocence and ignorant of sex. Now, in the terms of children's book discourse, the interesting thing about the idea of liminality is that it sets up a way of moving out of one of the most contentious and difficult issues for people working with children and their books. And that you've got suitability on one hand, and its opposite is what's not suitable or what's censored, right? So censorship. Okay, ready? Guesses? Yes. They. Now, that's right. That's good. And it's interesting because, I thought David, for anybody who's in education, David Booth is a really well-known person, a really well-known face. And this, as you'll see, is one of the points of the talk. Now, David is Professor Emeritus and Scholar in Residence at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Now, David begins his discussion on censorship by carefully tracing the word, as we ask as I said, we asked all our authors to do, if possible, and if it made sense, through its Latin root, to censere, to appraise, and censura, judgment, my Latin is not good. In English usage, in relation to children and their books, David then moves from Rousseau and the development of the idea of the natural child in need of protection, and that is in need of being kept ignorant. Now, David traces what is being challenged, which is the term that's often used in library context of when a book is censored. They don't say it's censored, they say it's challenged. And you think, is it like being, it's like me being short and having to wear high heels, so I'm height challenged or whatever. On the other hand, it is a term that's now being used. And when in David's essay, because he's coming at it from the position of someone who is really very deeply in the field of working with children and their books, he's got this completely terrific riff on challenged books. And I'm just going to read David's riff. Books targeted for promoting antisocial behavior include Dave Pilkey's Adventures of Captain Underpants, and he says, in 1997, Bad Behavior and Toilet Humor. Louise Fitzhugh's Harriet the Spy, Lying and Window Peeping. Paul Zindel's Pigman, Lying, Swearing, Drinking, Drug Abuse, Disrespect, and for Authority and Property. Robert Cormier's The Chocolate War, Mob Rule, Masturbation. S.E. Hinton, The Outsiders, Gangs. Alice Childress, A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, Drug Addiction, Swearing, Black Militancy. Trina Sharp Hyman's Called the Caught Winning, Little Red Riding Hood, Bottle of Wine in Little Red Riding Hood's Basket. Isabel Holland's Heads You Win, Tails I Lose, Drug Abuse. Safety concerns have also resulted in objections to books depicting young children engage in dangerous behaviors, such as turning on a stove, climbing a ladder, or walking alone. Books that have been banned due to depictions of violence include Fitzhugh's Bang Bang You're Dead and R.L. Stein's Wizard and Warriors and You series. Now, it's a completely lovely list, and it's one of the features of David's and the education pieces that are in this book. So in our keywords books. So we've got, as you can see, my talk has moved partly through intention, from intention to liminality to intention in children's literature, innocence, liminality, censorship. But I've had a second agenda as well, and I wanted to show you the interdisciplinary range of scholars invited to participate. And so you can see the way each of these pieces kinds of intersect, but also shows you how different scholars think and attend to the things which are central to their field, and yet how they can speak to the other disciplines. So the author, Philip Pullman, was one, speaking about his book. You've got an old children's literature scholar, Peter Hunt, a young literary scholar, Maura Gubar, rare book librarian, Michael Joseph, and educator, David Booth. Now, Phil and I were both conscious when we began that a scholar who's famous and instantly recognizable in one discipline is completely unknown, a complete no-name, completely unrecognizable in another discipline. And so we wanted to be able to set up keywords as a way of introducing scholars to each other. David Booth, everybody knows who he is. Peter Hunt, not a chance. Despite that Peter is really, if you get a chance to meet him, he's a lovely guy. In fact, I can definitely vouch for the personable qualities of all of these people. And so I thought I would end with a partial gallery of some of the people who wrote essays you'll find in keywords soon. Soon it will be in your local bookstore. This is Michael Heyman, who wrote an essay with Kevin Shortsleeve on nonsense. This is Michele Martin. Don't these people look like they're people you'd like to know? All of them? I know. On African American. The next one I think is somebody you will know. Anybody? It's Mavis Reimer on Home. Anybody? Joseph Thomas on Aesthetics. Kelly Hager on Body. And June Cummins on Marketing. So, I'm done. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Do you want to? Yes.
I have a question. It has to do with my background for many, many years as a bookseller, too.
Right.
And the fact that no one has suggested a book cover that has words on it, especially in fonts that suggest their time.
Yeah.
And really, for someone who's going to be interested in the modern aspects, to highlight liminality, postmodern, and give smaller fonts to,
I did actually, because I wrote to them and said, I really love print on print as a book cover. It's also something I like in paintings too. I like paintings that have print on them, and yes, we did suggest that, and it's yes, it's a good idea.
Not to be messy.
Oh, I know.
That's the problem.
Yeah. That's why we sent all those rejects back. But I'll say that I got that as a
someone spent 15 years putting book space out.
Okay, there you go. Exactly those details.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. I'll put that as a trace. And there was another question I saw. Someone else have a hand up?
Well,
yeah.
I know this whole business about binary and all that, but I'm sort of suspicious. I think that as human thinkers, that this cannot be a new concept, and that it may be a mistake to go back and not recognize those sorts of things in older children's literature, or even Shirley Temple. I mean, I know that often we have these conversations, and they get to be sexualizing things that Lewis Carroll did, or Hans Christian Andersen. There's a whole Joseph Cornell. You can name them. And sometimes I'm wondering if we're missing the point that these folks were in more of a liminal, and maybe even their personal lives. I can
address that, because it's actually something that I've been very interested in doing, and I'll address it in a slightly different way, if that's okay. In the other book that I've just done, I was very interested in late Enlightenment women, and one of the issues about why we do this in the binary is because we're using a romantic notion of Wordsworthian children as innocent. But and that's what colors the way we think. So we also think in terms of children's literature that you go from battle didactic to, if you're reading Darton, from battle didactic to good fantasy, right? If you move back to those late 18th century women, whom I've now come to adore, all right, you will find that they are very strong on advocating thinking and knowing children, so children who are socially responsible. And I see that as something that's very coherent with a 21st century model of a child, too. So I think that our idea of dividing it into binary comes from the notion of a romantic innocent child as the person we're addressing. If you change the form of address and think that what you're looking at is the kind of late 18th century child who was a thinking, knowing child, and there's one of my very favorite lines from William Godwin. It's in a letter, and he writes about having an active mind and a warm heart. That you can take that as a 21st century thing too. And I think the way you see this, and actually Mike was asking me about something I was doing in Barbados before. There is a point to this. I was doing some research and I'm going to tell you this story too. You guys okay? Everybody good with this? All right. I'm just slightly off track, but so I was in Barbados and I was doing work in the National Library there, and they only had an old microfilm reader, and so they had to set me up in it, and didn't have a printer, and I was working on these old newspapers from 1812 to 1814. And what was so horrific for me is that in the stories in the newspaper, so I'm going through issue by issue, day by day, 1812 to 1820, And I'm reading all these newspapers, and they have all these stories about the school that I was actually tracing, and which had a very progressive curriculum. But in the daily newspapers, along with the shipping news, and who's going where, and what theatrical performance, there's everything about slaves. Slaves are being bought, slaves are being sold, there's slaves in the cage in the middle of the town, and I found it incredibly upsetting. Anyway, so I was doing this on a Saturday morning, and 2 little boys, about 10, came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" And then I had this really awful moment when I was too embarrassed to tell them what I was doing. So I said, "Oh, I'm just looking at old newspapers." "What are you doing?" I said, changing the subject. And they said, and you could see it on their faces, they said, "Oh, we're researching slavery. We're looking at instruments of torture and how slaves were tortured by having, they were prodded in their ribs," and they pointed to their ribs. And I did the one good thing I could do that day. As it happened, I had been reading a guy named William McCarthy's new biography of Anna Barbald, and it's also something I knew, but this was fresh in my mind. In the 1790s, children gave up sugar to participate in the sugar boycott in order to support, because William Wilberforce's first bill to abolish the slave trade was defeated in the 1790s, so they gave up sugar. And so I said, "Did you know about the children who gave up sugar to support the abolition of slavery?" And they didn't know, but their faces instantly brightened. And I thought, it's the one damn good thing I did, which was show that these children, that there were children helping children. Now, the 21st century equivalents are very obvious. It's Craig Kielburger, and it's all about stopping children who are slave laborers, again, in exactly that way, or children who decide they're raising money for social activities.
But it's been going on, it went on mid-20th century.
Mid-20th century, yeah. But that what you've got is, and none of these things are obviously instant, but I think what you've got is a shift from you've got on either side of that romantic, innocent, and ignorant child, you've got a knowing, engaged, socially conscious child. And I think, so that's what I think we're looking at. So that gets you away from the binary when you change what the subject is. Okay? Sorry, that was very long.
Well, it sort of raises a point. When you're thinking historically, the first thing that comes to my mind is the literature portrayed children as being far more innocent at the time than they really were in real life.
Well, when you say that, it always depends on when you're talking about. Because children, depending on when you're looking at children in children's literature, they are not innocent. Certainly, if you're looking earlier, they are certainly.
You're talking, like Huck Finn. He certainly, in that era, they certainly weren't innocent.
No, and this has to do with constructions, with social constructions of children. And if you look earlier in the 17th century, children were regarded as wicked and in need of correction. So, how you construct children has to do. Literature reflects and is reflected by what you do.
Okay.
Yeah. So. But there's a kind of immediate reaction to assume that romantic innocence is the vision. It's your implicit assumption about children, or even the way they're depicted. Well, and it's also what from David's list of books, you can see that there's absolutely nothing that anybody can read because everything is completely
corrupt.
Yes, or going to be challenged on some grounds.
Or somebody's going to, talk about, I've seen the list of censored books, of banned
It's
books.
Scary.
And many of them are the greatest.
But you see, it wants to keep children ignorant. When you censor things, the idea is that it means you validate ignorance. And that's the whole idea about being innocent. It's someone who is before knowledge. So it's not just inexperience, but it's actually ignorant, which is the value.
The existence and creation of those books actually also speaks of a completely different point of view, and the point of view of those people that, no, we're not innocent, and let's have some fun, and kids are naughty, and let's be naughty, that's fun. I mean, it's a very middle class point of view. few.
Well, there are, and it's always interesting. One of the things that I like to look at is books that only went into one edition. There's a very famous book that since I've been so immersed in the 18th century, soaked in the 18th century lately, or early 19th century, there was a book called Senior Topsy-Turvy, done by Anne and Jane Taylor. Another, you won't know who they are, but yes, you do. You know. You do know. Well, go ahead. Jane Taylor, Twinkle Little Star is Jane, right. So the author of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star also did a book where that's about inversions, where the pigs are butchering the butchers, and completely grotesque. The fish are fishing for the fishermen, that kind of thing. And it only went to one edition. So those books don't circulate. And there's another book, one that also was a book that I knew would never get published in English, that I'd been given a modern book, a 1996 book, I think, that I'd found in English and French. And it was a book about an ogress who eats her own child. Oh. Yeah, it's a great book, Wolf Erbroch. No.
Yeah, but totally taboo subject.
Well, and I saw that book, and I thought it's a completely compelling book. It's a wonderful book, but it's never going to get published in English. I did actually send it to a publisher and knew it was never going to get published in English. But that whole idea about what's publishable and what's not, and for what reasons. And it is a book that I then, and I do write about this I actually worked with a bunch of 10 and 11-year-olds doing an English translation. And the children were completely brilliant on this. They realized it was the ogress's problem. And they realized that all the children were depicted as performing monkeys, and which is also William Godwin talks about that same sort of thing, little monsters of curiosity, he says, and Mary Wollstonecraft says something similar. Okay, yes?
Can I ask if one of the essays is a discussion of childhood?
Yes. Now, who's got the book?
I'm just going to remind you to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. The question was, yes, thank you for reminding me. Is there a discussion on childhood? Now, these are, fortunately for you, alphabetically listed. And Phil and I had this funny, Phil said, they're going to ask you about something and you won't be able to remember exactly what was in that essay. Anyway, yes, there is. It's by Karen Sanchez-Epler, who has written very beautifully about childhood.
And what is her
Well, again, I can't offhand remember. She's a literary scholar, I think, for now. No, it's okay. You can have a look. You're glad to know that there's childhood in the book? Okay. All right. Anybody else on it? What do you have? Mike. Mike, that's right. Cronus eating his own child. And there's, of course, a long history. It's what, in terms of child eaters, there's also Hansel and Gretel, exactly. This is in The Ogress in Tears. The scary thing is that she then mourns, so she doesn't realize she's eating her own child. She goes off looking for a child. One's too fat, one's too thin, one's too intellectual, one's got a missing arm. She looks and looks, she can't find them. But it's exactly that issue of, the image bears a resemblance, a family resemblance to Sendak's Wild Things. And you know that Sendak apparently used to receive lots of images that children would send the Wild Things, except in the images the kids sent, the Wild Things are eating kids, okay? And he knew he could never publish that, but the kids are sending the ones about eating kids. Okay, and it is it's an issue that's been around as well since those early 1800s.
Well,
William
is eating.
Yeah, exactly. And in I can't remember if that's exactly the piece. William Godwin did a version of the Odyssey as well for children. I think it was, did Godwin write it or Charles Lamb? It must have been. They had a discussion about whether or not they could have. I think it might have been. It was another sort of similar part about whether or not this is suitable for children in about 1810.
He censored himself, and he said he wouldn't write about Europa getting raped for a book for children.
On the other hand, the image. So the question was about rape for children. Sorry, but if you've read the Charles Keeping illustration for the
through the window.
No, it's not through the window. It's the one where the musket is. The highwayman.
Oh, right.
That's right. So in Charles Keeping, in that image, has a long rifle pointed, where she's pointed to her breast, and he says, this is a rape scene. And then the question becomes, is this suitable? And this has to do, again, with innocence and ignorance, or if you play the idea differently about knowingness, which is also a discussion that someone like Anne Higonnet has. Okay.
And yet it was considered acceptable in the late 50s, early 60s.
Well,
Published for World.
Well, another kind of thing I talk about was when I was working on the Norton adventure stories and cowboy stories. Were originally we were going to have a session on westerns. I'm Canadian and a girl, so I don't know much about cowboys to start with. But then when I went looking for cowboy books in my local libraries, all I can find are sensitive New Age cowboys. Like there are girl cowboys. There's a Princess and the Pea cowboy. There's black cowboys, African American cowboys, and there are, of course, the oxymoronic Indian cowboys. No, and I thought I wanted a sexist, rapist, killing and maiming cowboy. Like, where are those cowboys of the 1950s? And then did go find them. I had to go to the Library of Congress to find them. And of course, it's exactly what the baby George Bush, I use this line, would have been reading. Okay, those cowboys of the 50s, and that's why it's that's why you want to have those you want the historical trace because you want to know who was putting that cowboy language in their mouths. Yeah.
My question is, with all these different contributors and you working as an editor,
right.
Did you come away with your own encapsulation of the differences in approaches to children's literature from the different disciplines,
right.
from English education, library information studies, cultural studies? What stood out for you about the different approaches?
Okay. Judy's asked about what the different approaches are depending on the discipline and how that stood out. And I think what did stand out was actually something that I then put the trace in. So there are people who've come from very literary backgrounds, and this is sort of private, not exactly private, but their pieces tended initially to be thin on the actual children's books to which they'd applied. So you'd get the theoretical trace, and it would be very good, but we'd have to send those essays back and say, there's just not enough actual engagement with real children and with the discussion about people who are doing it. And similarly, we'd then get ones from education that were brilliant on the books, but wouldn't have the theoretical trace. And we also wanted people to as Phil and I said in some of our letters, we wanted them out of their comfort zones. So we would say, you've got this piece perfectly the way it is in libraries, in library science, or perfectly the way you've got it in education. But really, you have to go and see what these other people are saying about this in post-colonial studies. And so our contributors, who, as you can tell, were terrific, were very patient with us, and they would do that. And they would take those other issues. But, I think, I don't know whether it's just me, I can still see which ones are where. I learned a lot from doing this, and we also had long discussions about which words, which authors, and how we were going to try to balance them out. So that was a good question. We loved doing this. I loved working with Phil, and those of you who saw him last year, you'll know he's a terrific, very smart guy.
So what brings the disciplines together? If they're disparate in the way you're...
Well, it's the way that any kind of therapist works, right? You let the other person's voice come through. So in each one, you've got the other voices coming through, and the voices are in conversation with each other. So you listen to what the other person is saying, and that's why you've got Philip, and I think Philip Pullman's essay on intention is so interesting, because for a literary scholar would roll his or her eyes. Oh, intention. You can't ask. Nobody would ask that question, and yet he addresses that very seriously and very, directly. And so that's what you really want. You want that kind of respect. I did love Maura's essay on innocence. It really struck me as being just a terrific analysis. I am very interested in the word liminality, and we left the rest of... Michael had another whole piece on what's called communitas, and that's not in there. Now, those were really interesting pieces. Margaret Meek on reading these, and so it is at one level it is about the person coming through. I guess, and that's why I wanted to do their faces. I wanted you to see who these people are, who are so caring about their individual words, and how they've done them. I can actually. Do you want me just to read the list? It's alphabetical. Would you like that? It's 49.
Sure.
It's like 49.
When do you expect it in print?
It should be in print very soon. But it may be in print by the. I think actually May. We were hoping to get it out just before Christmas, but it's not going to happen. So it's got aesthetics, African American, audience, body, boyhood, censorship, character, childhood, children's literature, class, classic, crossover literature, which is actually a really good one, too, culture, domestic, education, empire, fantasy, gender, girlhood, golden age, graphic novel, home, identity, image, innocence, intention, Latino, liminality, literacy, marketing, modernism, multiculturalism, nature, that's by Peter Hollindale, that's a good one, nonsense, picture book, popular, post-colonial, postmodern, queer, race, reading, realism, science fiction, story, by Hugh Crago, it's very good, theory, David Rudd, who's also very good, tomboy, voice, and young adult. Quite a range, and we did work. We both edited all the essays, and we worked with all the authors as well. Yeah, well, it engages farther. The question was, what does the word queer? How does the word queer engage? And it does engage on the whole literary history of the way queer is used. Again, I can actually read you a little bit of the beginning of that one. It was Carrie Mallon who did that. Would you like to hear just a little bit of the beginning of that one? Yeah. So here is, okay. And she's actually, I'm doing this because I remember there's a lovely introduction. She says the word queer is a slippery one. Its etymology is uncertain, and academic and popular usage attributes conflicting meanings to the word. By the mid-19th century, queer was used as a pejorative term for male homosexual. This negative connotation continues when it becomes a term for homophobic abuse. In recent years, queer has had an additional uses, an all-encompassing terms for culturally marginalized sexualities, gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, as well as a theoretical structure for deconstructing the binary oppositions. So it sets up that very clearly, that govern identity formation. So we've really tried to get the authors to focus on what they're doing and yet get the detail in too. It's always a hard brief, no matter what you do, it's always academically hard. Spectacular about holding, as I did recently, Christina Rossetti's Sing Song, and it's in the British Library, and it's her own handwritten manuscripts. I handled as well Ted Hughes. I was talking about his manuscript collection, some unpublished stories. In the piece I did recently for the British Library, I did a keynote talk, and I used one of Ted Hughes's lines that he didn't actually have in a poem and he talked about the old age of childhood, which is such a resonant line, isn't it? And there is something quite magical about archival material when you are finding something that you can see how it plays out in an author's work, but that unless you're actually sitting there on your own, you can do this. And I have also been working with letters from the early 19th century that I've been unreferenced, unknown letters. It's very thrilling to do, and you get to see the paper and people writing. As you know, when Judy was talking about writing with quill pens, writing with quill pens is apparently very physically difficult. And these people who are writing in 1800 with quill pens, and their writing is so much nicer than mine any day. And I wonder, how did they do that? It is a magical experience of doing it. And I have the great privilege to live quite close to the Osborne Collection of Early Children's Books in Toronto. And that's my neighborhood archival collection, where they are always very patient with me. But I do work in other collections too. I work in, recently I've been working in the New York Historical Society, the Pforzheimer collection of Shelley and his circle at the New York Public Library. I've been working in Oxford in the William Godwin letters in the Bodleian, which are very extraordinary, including material on early children's book selling. So when he was running the children's books shop, that's there. And where else do I work? All of those places are magical in their own ways. I love actually the feeling of being. It has a kind of holy shriven feel. If you go into a rare books room, you're not allowed to take anything. So this is especially. It's often a girl problem. You know, girls not having any pockets. There's nowhere to put your library card. There's nowhere to put your pencils, and you have to take your computer out of its bag, and you're very focused. I love being focused in those libraries and work quite intensely in them. Well, thank you for being such a terrific, perfect audience too, and great questions. Thank you.